10.2 Anatomy of the Heart and Blood Flow through the Heart. We mentioned a moment ago the heart is a cone-shaped organ. It sits in the thoracic cavity below the sternum. Actually, the bottom of the heart is called the apex, and that is the tapering end of the cone-shaped muscular organ. There are 4 chambers inside the heart. The upper chambers are the atrium. These receive blood that's coming back to the heart from veins. The atria are on the top of the heart. And the 2 lower chambers are the ventricles. The ventricles are the pumping chambers. So when the heart contracts, these large ventricles force blood into the arteries where it is carried away from the heart. There are 2 pumps because there are 2 separate circuits that we're going to identify in just a moment. The pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. So 2 pumps, 2 ventricles, and then 2 receiving chambers. The different sides of the heart, the left and right side, are divided by a thick wall called the septum. In addition to the 4 chambers, we need to identify 4 different valves. 2 of these are called the Atrioventricular Valves, which is a nice name because it tells us exactly where they're located. They are between the atria and the ventricles. The purpose of these valves is to prevent backflow of blood into the atria. Whenever the ventricles contract, the blood needs to be forced into the arteries rather than back into the atria, and so these valves will snap shut. There are some tendons that prevent these from prolapsing back up into the atria. Occasionally, however, individuals have what is referred to as a heart murmur, and a heart murmur is caused by the prolapse of these valves. When the ventricles contract, the valves prolapse and allow some leakage of blood back into the atria, and that is what the physician refers to as the heart murmur. There are 2 other valves which are called the Semilunar Valves. The purpose of the Semilunar Valves is to prevent blood from flowing back into the ventricles. When the ventricles contract, that forces blood out the arteries. Between heartbeats, we don't want that blood to slip back into the ventricles, and so the Semilunar Valves prevent that backflow from arteries into the ventricles. There are 2 separate circuits, the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. So now we need to identify some blood vessels as well as the different chambers of the heart that are involved with each circuit. The systemic circuit is going to pump blood to all body parts except the respiratory system. It begins with the left ventricle. When the left ventricle contracts, that is going to force blood through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. So the largest artery is the aorta. The red arching vessel here in the diagram represents the aorta. The aorta then branches into smaller arteries, arterioles, finally capillaries, delivering blood out to the systemic capillaries. And then eventually that blood from the systemic circuit returns to the heart through the vena cava. The superior vena cava brings blood back from the head, the neck, and the upper extremities. The inferior vena cava brings blood back from the lower part of the body. Now these are different colors because that blood that is leaving the left ventricle in the aorta is oxygenated blood, and we use red to represent oxygenated blood. But that oxygen is going to be delivered in the systemic capillary beds. And as that oxygen is delivered, the blood picks up carbon dioxide. So the blood that is returning in the vena cava is deoxygenated blood, and we use the color blue to represent that deoxygenated blood. So the systemic circuit is from the left ventricle out the aorta, and it returns in the vena cava to the right atrium. The other circuit is the pulmonary circuit, and it only goes from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart. The pulmonary circuit begins in the right ventricle. When the right ventricle contracts, blood is forced through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries branch and they're going to deliver this blood to the right and left lung. And this is represented by blue because this is the deoxygenated blood that has just returned from the systemic circuit. So we want to pump it to the lungs so we can dump off carbon dioxide and pick up some fresh oxygen. So from the right ventricle out the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, and then that will return to the heart through the pulmonary veins. There are 4 pulmonary veins. Pulmonary veins are going to return oxygenated blood to the left atrium. And so we have completed the pulmonary circuit. So that oxygenated blood that returns to the left atrium can pass through the left atrioventricular valve into the left ventricle and be pumped to the systemic circuit once again. Here is a diagram that represents the heart, the 4 chambers of the heart, and both the pulmonary and systemic circuits. So you simply need to spend a little bit of time studying this diagram. Start, for example, in the left ventricle. Follow that blood out the aorta and into the systemic capillary beds. Then it's going to come back in either the superior or inferior vena cava to the right atrium, through the right atrioventricular valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle then pumps blood to the pulmonary circuit. And so you see in the upper center portion the little short pulmonary circuit, which only goes from the heart to the lungs and back. And so simply spend a little bit of time tracing this out until you can begin at any point and trace a drop of blood through both circuits of the cardiovascular system.